first time I suppose I escaped death was in 79, early 80, when the Alexander Keeland, which is a semi-submersible rig in the Eckefis field of the North Sea, went down, and I should have been on board that night that went down, only because the Norwegians had overbooked. Did I have a message at Norwich Airport to go back home again, which is 47 miles from Norwich, to go home and wait for the next couple of days before they could get us a place on the rig. And at 9 o'clock on the 9 o'clock news that night, it went down, and I lost 123 men that I knew on that, good friends of mine on that rig. And it seems very coincidental that the week before, that when we came off, that some of the lads was mussing about with a Ouija board. Anyway, they all came in to the room that night. I was up in the top bunk reading my book. I wasn't really taking a lot of notice, and then 2 or 3 other lads was watching, and this one lad was supposed to be speaking to his father, and obviously getting through to somebody, because he could understand whatever was saying and was going on. It was spelling out his dad's name and blah blah blah, and all of a sudden it said, "I've got to go." And when the son wrote why, he said, "Because they're after me," or "It's after me." And with that he said, "Well, don't go, Dad." But before he could say anything else, the glass just leaped off the table, and they only had the little fingers on the glass, all 4 of them, smashed up against the bulkhead, as we call it, and that was it. I just flew into a rage and threw everybody out. And it seems quite coincidental that about a week to 10 days after that, the Alexander Keelan was lost at sea.
Mum as a child used to live between Ireland and Glasgow, and used to spend 6 months in Ireland in the summer working on the farm with the grandparents, and 6 months at school in Glasgow. Now, when Mum was really little, Mum's one of 6, and she remembers vividly on a fishing boat. It was always fishing boats they took, and she remembers on a fishing boat sitting out on the deck with the waves coming about 6 feet over the boat, and being really, really scared. She was only about 2 or 3, because her younger brother was only an infant, and her mother had the baby in the arms, and she was praying. And she tied them all together, and Mum remembers the men taking the lifeboats out, shouting women and children first, and that's why they were all sitting up on the deck. And my gran says to her, "There's no way you can remember that." And Mum says, "I can't, I was that scared." So they went back to Glasgow. They got there okay, the storm had abated and the ship was all right. On the way back, on the following year, when they're back in Ireland again, heading back towards Glasgow, the boat they were due to get, they were all packed up ready to go. They woke up and the baby had caught chicken pox, and they couldn't go on that boat, and the boat went down on the way over.
Now, there was also a time again in the Eckefis field when I gave up my seat for somebody that I don't know whether his father or mother had died, or mother-in-law or whatever. I went out with a boat, and the chopper went down and all 18 was killed on board. There was another case when I was waiting to come home, and it got to about 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and I could think, "Oh God, I'm going to get home tonight." Time we get back to England, and our manager came by and he said, "What's the matter, Chester?" I said, "Oh, bloody chopper's always late." He said, "Don't worry, son," he said, "that won't be coming again." He said, "They've all gone down as well." And I felt such a prat after standing there moaning about it. So I've been rather fortunate in one way or another.
The psychiatric nurse. One night she had 2 women and twin girls brought into the hospital completely off their head, and what happened was the 4 of them were playing with a Ouija board, and whatever they contacted sent the 4 of them off of it. One of the girls, the two women were just very violent, completely hysterical. They had to be restrained and committed to the mental hospital, and I think they're still there now. That was like 10-15 years ago. The twin girls, one of them lies in a bed all the time, and all she says, her mouth doesn't open, and the nurses are frightened to sit with her, and all she says is, "Help me, help me," in this little tiny voice, and her mouth doesn't open, and every one of the nurses is terrified of her. Yeah, and she just lies there paralysed, and she's fed through like a drip, because she can't move. The other twin goes about the hospital on all 4s, galloping and screaming like something's after her, and whatever the 4 of them contacted, it sent the 4 of them off their head. Mum came in and says, "Don't any of you dare touch a Ouija board." That night she came in from the hospital.
few years ago, I was in college in a lesson, and we were talking about the news on television, about what stories make the news, and what was in the headlines at that particular day. And there was nothing much, so I said, jokingly, I must tell you this was a joke, to the person sat next to me, what we need is a good plane crash. This was on a Monday afternoon, the last lesson, and would you know it, the day after the Tuesday, a plane went and dropped out the sky over Amsterdam. I don't know if you remember the incident, but I've never forgot that, and I just think that I'm somehow responsible for it, and I feel awful.
My mum works as a psychiatric nurse. She has a lot of geriatric patients, in the mental hospital she works in Glasgow. And she says that during the day, they're going to die because you can see death in their face. Now she says that maybe only because she's trained in it as a nurse that you can see they're going to die. And she says they do things like they give away things. They know themselves they're going to die. They'll say, you can have my television, you can have my book, this is yours. Yeah? And she says, you constantly say to them, oh, don't be so silly, you're not. She says, but you can see it in their face. She says, the face loses all life. And she says, it's not something you can say to somebody that doesn't know. You can't say to them, they didn't look alive. But she says they look a bit grey and look a bit drawn. And she says you can see death in their face. It's the only way she can describe it. She says, and the other nurses say, I don't like anybody to die on their own. So that person's going to die tonight. I want somebody to sit with them. And they always send a nurse in to sit in the room with them. A couple of seconds before they die, they sit up in bed and they lean out towards something at the bottom of the bed. And Mum says you always grab their hand because you think they're leaning out to somebody that's alive, to save them. They're a bit frightened, they're a bit upset, they don't know what's happening to them, they know they're dying, but they want somebody to comfort them. She says, but they throw you off. If you grab their hand, they don't want you, and they lean out past you and they're not wanting you at all. And Mum says that all of the people she's seen die have done that. It's like they're leaning out towards something else that's there, something else that's calling them, not the person next to them, and they're oblivious to you.
This was a dream I'd had, which I suppose you could describe as a premonition. I'd had a few of these at the time, whereby I dreamed something, and 3 days later, something to do with it seemed to happen. Now, in this dream, I remember this little chap, which I didn't know very well. I knew his cousin. He'd had something wrong with one of his eyes. It had whited over or sort of flipped over or something. I remember having to carry him because he couldn't see where he was going. Through school to get to the ambulance that was waiting out the front. Now, 3 days later, this boy's cousin and another chap were sitting in a maths lesson, and they were aggravating me, basically. They were saying sort of things about me and that I could hear. At the end of the lesson, I picked up this maths textbook and just chucked it at this other chap, and it hit him in his eye. I think the same eye as the little chap, that had whited over. Now, I think it's quite strange that the little chap who I dreamt of, that had his eye whited over, it happened to be his cousin that was talking to the boy that I hit in the eye with a textbook, and it was 3 days after I dreamt it, like several other premonitions, if you like, that I'd had.
When I was a student, I lived in student digs in Lower Broughton, in Salford again. My sister had the big room at the front of the house. She had a really restless night. And she says to me in the morning, oh God, she had a really bad time. She said, just always from sleep, I couldn't sleep. And I thought, what's wrong with you? She goes, the air in that room's not very good. It's a pretty damp house, I don't feel very well. So anyway, we'd gone out and we phoned a friend from Scotland. And the friend says, were you out last night? And Claire says, no. She said, I don't feel very well, I had a bad night. She says, I had this dream about you. She says, you were dancing. Claire says, I was dancing. She says, yeah. She says, you were in my bedroom. She says, I saw you. You were dancing. She described to Claire exactly what she'd done before she went to bed that night. She says, you had red leggings on, a little white spotty dress. And, she says, this is what you were wearing. And it really freaked Claire out. She says exactly what she was wearing. And Claire had a bad sleep, felt really sort of hyper and up, emotional. And her friend says, I saw you in a dream. And the final scary bit was, she said, she actually described the bedroom to Claire where she was dancing, and she'd never been in the house. She was from Scotland.
A college friend of mine told me recently that she'd had kind of like a nightmare a while back now. She dreamt that her dad's car had got broken into. The windows were smashed, the locks were done, the lot. And at the time, her dad didn't actually live with her. And the next day, I think she just actually got up, and the phone rang, and it was her dad, and he'd said, "My car was broken into last night," and he was sort of, obviously really upset. And of course, so was my friend, because she'd had this kind of premonition, and she thought it was really strange.
I've got loads of relatives, and I've got 27 first cousins, so I've got loads of aunts and uncles. Now, one of the things the women in the family used to do was get together for women's nights in. And one of the women in the family fancied herself as a bit of a medium. She thought, I can tell everybody's fortune. And this was a great giggle because she knew everybody. So she would say to my mother, "You've got 5 kids. You're going to have 5 kids. You're going to be surrounded by music," which is true. We all play musical instruments. Yeah, she knew us all, so she could tell you exactly what age you were, how many kids, how many girls, how many boys. So it was a big laugh. One of my aunts had recently married into the family. She'd married my mum's youngest brother. And my aunt was reading these tea leaves at the time, and she'd reading them through, and everybody was joking and laughing. She got to my Aunt Christine, and she said, "I'm not going to read your cup," threw it down and smashed it. Now, this was on a Sunday evening about midnight. She smashed the cup on the floor and left the room in a real panic, and she was quite an old woman, and she got up and left in quite a hurry. The other woman in the family says, "Oh, we're not talking to you. You have really upset her. My Aunt Christine's running crying, there's something wrong. I've not been accepted in the family. She saw something against me. She's really got it in for me." So all the rest of the women in the family wouldn't speak to this aunt because of what she'd done to this new member of the family. And it wasn't until about 6 months later that my mum being the psychiatric nurse, thought, "I'll better get the family back together," sort of thing, goes to speak to my aunt. Says, "What have you done? You've got that woman really scared. She thinks the family are against her. Don't want to know. She come out on this women's night out. You treated her really badly. You're still not speaking to her, and you still won't tell her. What on earth are you going to tell her?" Yeah, it was a really evil thing to do. You've really hurt her. That's a bad thing to do. She says, "I saw a wee black face." She says, "Hands up in the air." She says, "I saw the devil in that cup." She says, "I smashed that cup." So Mum thought, "Oh, where you go. That is out of it. You're completely out of it. Don't you ever dare tell anybody that. You've told me that. Don't you tell me it." 4 months later, my Aunt Christine was diagnosed with cancer, which was very far gone, and she died a year later.
This happened about a year ago now, and my cousins, they live about 100 miles from where I am, and my cousin, Sarah, she has 3 rabbits. Well, I say she had 3 rabbits, and what happened was I had this dream. I live in Norfolk and she lives, in Bedfordshire, and I had this dream that one of her rabbits died. Now, she had a brown rabbit, a ginger rabbit, and a white rabbit, and I dreamt that the white one died. Woke up in the morning and thought, "Oh, it's a dreadful dream." I was a bit upset about it because I'm an animal lover myself, but I didn't tell anyone about it. And then, lo and behold, a week later, the damn thing dies. I got a phone call saying, "My rabbit died." "Oh, which one?" "The white one." And it was just the most freakiest experience ever. It was just dreadful. I felt really awful. I blamed myself for ages. I felt really awful.